people have this idea that the rainforest is being destroyed because there are these small farmers who need to make a living and they are cutting, trees to plant, their little plots. And that's not actually what is destroying the forest.
When your researchers, for example, are trying to verify this information, how do you do that in environments where violence is such a very real threat? And as you said, your friends and colleagues have actually been killed.
The deforestation in the Amazon has been going down in the last few years.
Hi, I'm Dominic Bowen, host of the International Risk Podcast, and today we're joined by César Muñoz. He's the Brazil director at Human Rights Watch, where he supervises research, advocates for foreign and domestic policies that promote human rights, and he leads fundraising efforts across the country. César's researched and written reports and articles, he's produced videos and conducted advocacy on human rights abuses linked to illegal deforestation, to police abuses, inhumane prison conditions, political persecution, and even unchecked domestic violence. In our conversation with César today, we really hope to gain a good insight on the protection of the Amazon, in particular focusing on organised crime, how supply chains can be tainted with abuses, environmental destruction, and what this means for business leaders and policy advisors around the world. César, welcome to the International Risk Podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being here.
César, I'd love to hear from your really central vantage point. Talk about the convergence between crime in the Amazon. What does it look like on the ground, and what's changed in recent years? It's more than just an environmental story today. It's much more complex, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. I think, I see it not just as an environmental sort of crisis in the Amazon that we're seeing, but a human rights crisis. And, I think sometimes people have this idea that the rainforest is being destroyed because there are these small farmers who need to make a living and they are cutting, trees to plant, their little plots. And that's not actually what is destroying the forest. You need capital. It's big business to destroy the rainforest. Just to explain a little bit the dynamics of what typically happens in the rainforest in the Amazon, usually you have a pristine area, usually owned by the federal government, which owns large swaths of land, or it might be indigenous territory, and sort of these groups will come in with tractors, chainsaws, a lot of people who are hired to do that, come in and cut the most valuable timber in the area. They will pull it out and then they will destroy the rest. I mean, they just cut it down, leave it on the ground, let it dry, and then burn it. And then that land then becomes cattle ranches, usually. These groups that are responsible for that are organized crime. I mean, there are these networks that operate in the rainforest that are involved in illegal logging. Then the transport of the timber through roads requires permits, so there is an element of corruption there to get the permits. Then the land is sold illegally. There might be illegal mining as well in those areas. So it's a complex web of different illegal activities that are carried out by these organized crime groups.
I think it's a really interesting sentence you used, César, when you said it's big business to destroy the Amazon. It's a really interesting juxtaposition. And we know that there's that intersection of diverse criminal activities, the drug trafficking, the illegal mining, the illegal logging, land grabbing, corruption, money laundering, and sadly, often violence. And often it occurs simultaneously and it reinforces each other in the same locations. And there's lots of evidence about how these criminal networks, land grabbing, and they're using the timber, the gold, and cattle is almost this integrated, multi-pronged business. Can you tell us how these groups, like in reality, whether they're cartels or local actors, how are they actually operating? What do their business models look like? What does it mean for the local communities and the people living in these areas?
Well, I mean, it depends on the area. I mean, the Amazon is just huge, thousands and thousands of square miles. So the situation at the border with Brazil, Colombia, and Peru is different from other areas, right? Basically because of the source of money is different. So at that border, the main sort of incentive is drug trafficking. So bringing cocaine from Peru and Colombia through the rivers in the Amazon and through the air as well, because it's not very well patrolled, and there are illegal landing spots across the Amazon, right? But that sort of drug trafficking is intertwined with other illegal activities like illegal fishing or illegal mining. I mean, for example, to reach the areas of illegal mining, you often need to travel by air, right, through small planes. You can use these small planes as well to carry drugs, right? So we have seen an increase in drug trafficking in the Amazon because of that infrastructure that was there to carry out environmental crime. In other areas of the Amazon, sort of the presence of drug trafficking is not as prevalent because they're far from the borders. And there, what I've seen, I was in the Amazon in February in an area around Altamira, which is a large well, not a large city, it's a large municipality. It's like 1,000 kilometers across. So it is huge. It's bigger than Spain, actually, just this municipality. And there, I would describe it as a network of criminal groups, right? So there are groups that operate in an area that do mostly the logging. Others then sort of specialize in the illegal cattle ranching, and they're connected, right? So that's sort of the scenario. And you mentioned something that is really important, which is sort of what's the impact on people on the ground, right? I mean, this has an impact on everybody because of the dirt trafficking and climate change and all that. But the people who are most affected are those who live there. And imagine if you are a small community in making a living in one of these areas. These illegal criminal groups, part of their business model is to threaten and attack people who live there because you witness the illegal activities. So there is a risk that you could report that to the police. So the legal groups, I mean, everywhere, intimidate and threaten local residents, and if they speak up, they are killed.
So obviously, as you just said, if they speak up, they're killed. The threat of violence and the actual perpetration of real violence is a big deterrent. You also mentioned earlier on the corruption from some officials, maybe security services. But it's quite hard. I think we all know, we've all been taught, we've all heard about the size of the Amazon forest. Some have been blessed enough to actually see the Amazon forest, but notwithstanding that, I mean, illegal airstrips, roads, ports, supply hubs, cattle ranching. These are huge projects. These are not just small little activities. It's hard to actually fathom how these occur. I mean, Brazil is a developed country. I mean, we're talking about the powerhouse that Brazil is today. It's obviously one of the leading members of the BRICS. How does this occur today? Is there something else that we're missing, or is it just simply corruption? Because it's hard to fathom the size of these operations and the huge risks they present. Of course, they're offering significant opportunities to criminal actors, but it's hard to work out how these actually get set up and how they're maintained.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think, when you go to these places, there is often very little state presence, right? So large areas without, significant police and prosecutors. So that's definitely a challenge for Brazil. But there is more that can be done. Absolutely, yes. And I'll give you, a very important example, which is cattle. Cattle is the main driver of deforestation. When you cut down the rainforest, most of the land then is used for cattle ranching, right? The land in many areas is too poor for crops, really. So you do cattle ranching, which is very unproductive. So you have few heads of cattle per, in the area. So it's just a disaster. But that cattle is sold and then it enters the legal supply chain, right? And that's where Brazil needs to get its act together, because there is a very easy way to prevent that, which is to control every head of cattle in the country, and that can be done. You need traceability for cattle in Brazil, and that has not happened because mostly opposition from agribusiness in the country. So there is, uh, there is that political dimension, their influence in Congress and all that, but it has to be done. And if you do that, then you eliminate a huge economic incentive for the destruction of the rainforest.
And so I'd like to speak to you specifically about the incident involving the murders of Dom Phillips and Bruno Pereira. Now, that was in June 2022, and it was in a remote valley, and it was a targeted attack against these what many people are calling defenders of the Amazon. And I think this incident, highlights the extreme risks facing journalists, indigenous rights advocates, and just local communities that are in the areas that are dominated by organized crime. And I want to highlight that Dom Phillips, he was a British journalist researching a conservation book, and Bruno Pereira was a respected, really well respected Brazilian expert on both indigenous affairs, and they were both working to protect the rainforest and to protect and advocate for local communities. They were ambushed, they were shot, and they were killed by local fishermen. Fishermen with, as you spoke about before, with ties to organized crime. Now, this incident was shocking and it was saddening, but I think you've said previously, Caesar, that these weren't isolated targets. This is just a symptom, a very tragic symptom, but a symptom of this capture of communities and silencing of voices. How are these criminal groups maintaining control, and how are they so powerful?
So I knew them well. Um, so this was really heartbreaking for me on a personal level. Dom so lived in Brazil for many years. He moved to Rio first, to Rio de Janeiro, and I was working on police violence there for several years, and so we met, and so he was just um, a wonderful human being and a great reporter. So I was really saddened by what happened. The killing of Dom and Bruno was unusual in a way because it got so much attention. Mostly probably because Dom was killed because he was a British reporter. Um, but unfortunately, as you said, it's not isolated. Most people who are killed in the Amazon are local residents who either report illegal activities or threaten to report them. Right. And I'll give you, a little example. There is a community called Terranosa, which is in the middle of Pará state. And this area is settled by small farmers that were, placed there by the government, and is intended as a sustainable development project. So they have small plots, and when it was created, there was this huge rainforest there that they could go and collect nuts, Brazil nuts, which are very valuable. And so that was sort of the intention of this project. But what happened is that these criminal groups entered the area, cut down the forest, put cattle there. They do illegal mining right now. And then they threaten the residents. And so in 2018, they killed 3 people there. I know this case well because I was researching a report at the time, and this was one of the cases we used in the report. I interviewed the people who live there, and talked to the police and prosecutors about the cases. And what happened was that the murders were not properly investigated, and that's sadly what happens everywhere in the Amazon. People get killed, and so the police that are tasked with investigating these crimes are local police in these remote areas, where the local elite are the criminal groups, right? The landowners, quote unquote, uh, are the ones that are influential, that get the mayor elected and so forth. So there's all this pressure not to investigate cases, and so there is huge impunity for this violence.
And I wonder, these high profile incidents, obviously, very tragic what happened to both of these men. But I'm wondering what it means for local communities, because as you said, most of the people that are killed and are threatened, intimidated, their lives are disrupted, both by threats and violence from organized crime, but also just the destruction to the land and the livelihoods. So I'm wondering, what does this mean for Indigenous communities? If you can help our listeners understand, what does this look like for Indigenous communities, for defenders who are living and working on these front lines? What does that mean for them on a daily basis?
That's a great question. So I'll give you another example. As I mentioned, I was in the Amazon in February, last February. I went to a community called Cachoeira Seca. So this Cachoeira Seca is it takes 1.5 days by boat to reach from Altamira. So it's very remote. It's very large, and there are three villages there of indigenous people who were contacted only in the 80s. So there are people there who were born, uncontacted by people outside of the community. I went to this village and it's under siege. I mean, it's just surrounded by these cattle ranches. I mean, from the village you can hear the chainsaws. These people, they have this sustainable way of life. They have small plots around the village where they have pumpkins and a few other things. They fish and they collect nuts. And they told me, look, we used to go hunting for several days, and during these hunts, like we sleep, they go and sleep in the forest. Everybody comes, older people come, and the children come, and we explain to our children, about the forest. This tree is used for that. It's very valuable knowledge that sustains their culture, and they cannot do it anymore. They cannot go on these hunting trips anymore because they are surrounded by the cattle ranches. So the impact is incredibly heartbreaking because they're physically under threat and culturally under threat. Now uh, there is obviously a role for the state. The state has to take over the areas that are being invaded by the ranchers and expel them. And I was in the ranches. I mean, this everybody knows. I mean, you if you look on the satellite, you see them. So the issue is that the state has done that in the past, and sort of these illegal groups come back. The ranchers come back because there is no state presence there. So you can expel them today, and in a few months they're there again. That's why you need the control of the supply chain. You have to make it impossible for them to sell the cattle. That's the way to do it. And of course, you have to have presence of the state. You have to have police. So in this area that is very large, you have to have a police station at the entrance of the territory in a couple of places, so you can control it.
You mentioned supply chains. We'll come back to that, Caesar, because I think that's a really important point. But if we look at multinational companies, if we look at board members and executives in European and US companies, they'll often think about the Amazon and the Amazon's deforestation as a reputational issue for NGOs or an issue for activists. But I think the research and some of the research your team's been leading, but certainly research from other places as well, that shows that the risk and the structural risk to multinational companies, to European, to US companies operating in Brazil, is multifaceted, and it's real. It's around climate change, it's around legal exposure, reputational damage is unavoidable, but there's things like modern slavery, and of course there's even operational displacements that they need to be considering. Which of these do you think CEOs and business leaders should be losing sleep over first?
Look, I think so. Right now, for example, the cattle supply chain in Brazil is tainted. Nobody, no company can say those that operate in the Amazon, right? None of them can say, "Look, it's clean," because they don't control the suppliers. They only have control over the direct suppliers, but those direct suppliers buy from others, right? So that's a huge reputational issue for any company that will supermarket in France that buys from a company that supplies from the Amazon right now. So there has to be pressure from the buyers, from the importers of meat from Brazil on the multinational companies that operate in Brazil to clean up the supply chain. And as I said, this is not even an issue of cost in my view, because it's not that complicated and it's not that expensive. It's an issue of being willing to do it. It has other sort of benefits because if you actually control every head of cattle, you know where it was born, at what time, what day, then the control of their sanitary conditions is better as well. You have any outbreak of disease, then you're going to identify the farm immediately. And that cannot be done right now because they don't have individual sort of traceability. So that, in my view, has to be done. As I said, these farms that operate in protected areas, for example, that are illegal farms, they are not even economically interesting for Brazil. There is no incentive for the person who controls the land to invest there, increase productivity, because they are not really the owners. They are, invaded the land, and there is that uncertainty about ownership. So, I think Brazil will be much better, having better control over the herd, and incentivizing investment for those who have like the legal title of the land, right?
And you've been really critical of supply codes of conducts and periodic audits, and I think there's a lot of validity behind that. I think a lot of companies, European companies, North American companies that I work with, will often rely when I ask them about their governance and their supply chains, and they'll say, "Well, we have really robust codes of conduct." But having internal and external audits is a really great way to verify that. But from what I understand from you and some of your research, a lot of these approaches fail in the Amazon context. Can you talk to us about what does realistic due diligence? What should companies that want to be doing the right thing, that don't want their reputation damaged, they don't want to be contributing to negative or climate change, full stop. They don't want the legal exposure. What should they be doing to make sure that their engagement with Brazil and in Brazil is ethical and is consistent with good moral human rights obligations?
I think they have a lot of power as the buyers of products that are produced in the Amazon to change the reality on the ground in a way that uphold human rights and protects people, right? Uh, so they have to use that power, and that power is to pressure suppliers in the Amazon. As I said, there has to be that control over cattle, but other commodities as well. Gold is mined in the Amazon. There is an estimation that about half of it is illegal mined gold. So there a range of products where uh, there is clearly illegal activity in the Amazon, that product that is illegally sort of produced is entering the supply chain. So there is that pressure from outside, but there is a role for Brazilians as well. I mean, definitely Brazilian companies. The government is taking some steps. So, for example, the government of Pará state, which is the state that has the highest deforestation in the Amazon, is working on a project to have traceability for cattle, right? So that's a very good news. The big sort of challenge is implementation, because if you create the program, you have to monitor and oversee what's happening, and that there Brazil is failing. In this area that I mentioned, Cachoeira Seca, so all the logging, there is only one road in that area, right? I went there through the river, but there is a road which is the Transamazonica, the Trans Amazon Road, and the timber is going through there. The thing is that there are no controls on the road. I mean, if you had, police controlling the timber trucks, then that will be helpful. You could still sort of have fraudulent papers, but if you don't even check, that's even worse, right? So this, as I said, there is this traceability project in Pará, and I think which is great, and we applauded. We met with the team that is putting it together. It has to be enforced. Now, this is Pará. At the federal level, there is also an effort to have traceability, but the deadline for the implementation is 2032, which is, I mean, it's too far. Come on, 7 years. You need 7 years. I mean, this is a problem that we've known for decades, and you still need another 7 years to implement it. And I fear what happens often in Brazil is that you have a new law, a new project, and it's not implemented by the deadline, and it's just postponed and postponed forever. So there has to be a sense of urgency to have better control over the economic activities in the Amazon.
But in practice, I mean, you talked about the violence. It's not incidental. We know it's how these markets actually operate. Without the threat or the actual conduct of violence, many of these illegal operations would start to fall apart. But I wonder, what does that mean for companies? What does it mean for even your researchers who are trying to audit and verify whether it's what's occurring in these areas, or verify that supply chains and suppliers are ethical? where there is this risk of violence. I've got clients that are working across Latin America, and the auditors are regularly just simply saying we cannot. It's too risky. Now, I think there are ways to do it, but I'd love to hear from you. When your researchers, for example, are trying to verify this information, how do you do that in environments where violence is such a very real threat? And as you said, your friends and colleagues have actually been killed.
Yeah, there is an issue of violence and threats there. And we have, when we travel to the Amazon, we have our security plans and all that, which are difficult because these are very remote places. If something happens to you, there's no, it's not that you can call a phone number and they're going to send a helicopter. So I mean, there is a level of risk when you work in the Amazon. Yeah, that is gonna happen, I think. um, the people who are more at risk are not Human Rights Watch researchers like us. It's the people who stay there, who are there, the people who talk to us. So that's the real sort of danger. We have been calling on the state to strengthen protection measures. Brazil has a protection mechanism for people at risk. Most of them who are on this sort of program, the risks are related to land and environmental crime, actually. You know, and so there are measures like police protection, having access to sort of a prosecutor, for example, having on your cell phone. So those, that has to be strengthened. When you attack sort of the sources and the roots of the threats and the violence, that's what will be most effective. And I'll go back to an example. So in Terra Nosa, this community that I described before of small farmers who had this sustainable sort of project, we've been pushing the authorities to evict the invaders for years. I talked to the Attorney General about this. So Brazil, to several ministers, and Brazil created a working group to carry out those evictions, right? Um, so that's the way to go, because the problem for that community is that the sort of these criminal groups that have armed men in the territory are there. I mean, so the way to protect them is to expel these groups, right, which are illegally there. That's complicated, but can be done.
Yeah, it's certainly a complicated picture, and I know the work that Human Rights Watch, especially in Brazil, is you've been documenting, researching, engaging with communities that have been living with this fear, living with the threats, living with the death of colleagues. I know you released a report, I think it was 2019, that described the killing of two people after they expressed their intent to denounce illegal logging that was occurring in their area. Then a third person vanished, and then the brother of one of the victims who was trying to investigate the crime was also killed. I mean, this is just tragic, and it just doesn't stop. So the work that you're doing is just so important, Caesar. So thank you for the work that you and your colleagues are doing. When you look around the world, Caesar, and you see so many things going on in Brazil, but also more broadly across the region and globally, what are the risks that concern you the most?
I don't know. I mean, I think climate change is has to be top of the list for everybody, and is very closely related to the work we are doing in the Amazon, because the Amazon is a key answer and a key ecosystem for the regulation of climate around the world. There, I don't want to sound totally pessimistic. I mean, the deforestation in the Amazon has been going down in the last few years. Uh, Brazil had, a president, Jair Bolsonaro, for 4 years, who was absolutely terrible for the Amazon. He effectively gave green light for the destruction of the rainforest, and and deforestation spiked tremendously. Now there is a new government that expressed sort of its commitment to protect the rainforest, and the deforestation rate has decreased by half. So it's a success story, but more can be done. And we discussed that how Brazil can do better to protect the rainforest. Another sort of thing that or trend that really worries me is the sort of undermining of international law and international humanitarian law. I mean, we see it in conflicts around the world, uh, an attack on multilateral institutions and the rule of law. Whether it's in Gaza or Ukraine or other places. That is a concern because we are going back to a world where those who are powerful can do whatever they want and they are not restricted by human rights and international law.
Thanks very much for explaining that, Cesar. I appreciate your insights there. And thank you very much for coming on the International Risk podcast and giving that insight.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Well, that was a really great conversation with César Muñoz. He's the Brazil director at Human Rights Watch. And I really appreciated hearing his thoughts on the difficulties of protecting the Amazon, the international risks, the role of organised crime, and the implications for business leaders and policymakers around the world. Please make sure you go to the International Risk Podcast website and subscribe to our mailing list to ensure you get our newsletter every second week in your inbox. Today's podcast was produced and coordinated by Alyssa Garbell. I'm Dominic Bowen, your host. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll speak again soon.